Welcome, everyone. We're very pleased to have our guest speaker, Dr. Nancy Scott. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin and her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Houston. Dr. Scott is a research psychologist and program manager for the National Center for Research, Outcomes, and Investigations Division of Telehealth and Technology. She's also an affiliate associate professor at the University of Washington Medical School, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Scott is a co-investigator on a large Department of Defense suicide grant designed to examine suicide mortality in relation to deployment among a large military cohort comprising 4.1 million current and former service members. She also leads and manages several research initiatives related to advancing knowledge of suicidal behavior among service members and veterans. Her other research interests are military mental health stigma and innovative technology-based psychological health interventions and tools for military personnel, veterans, and their families. Dr. Scott.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to give you a few more details about the presentation before we get started here. So here's the agenda, and I'm going to spend just a little bit of time going over this to make sure from the outset you're clear on where we're going to be going. So first of all, I want to give you an overview of the National Center of Telehealth and Technology. That is the organization that I belong to, and then I'm going to talk about suicide. That's really the topic today, is suicide. And at the National Center of Telehealth and Technology, we have a number of projects going on that are oriented towards suicide. We have 2 federally funded grants, but we also are the mechanism for monitoring and surveilling all of the suicides that occur worldwide among service members. So we do that at T2. So I thought I would focus on that piece of it that's oriented toward prevention. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is thinking about suicide and how we can prevent it. One way is by surveillance. So that's the DODSR. Next, I'm going to talk about a study in which it's got sort of a novel methodology, because what we are doing in this next project outlined here with the CDC as we're linking databases, 2 large databases to obtain more data. So I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to segue into stigma. The reason for this is that as you all know, suicide is a big problem, and there are a lot of people very concerned about it. That's the reason why we're trying to prevent it. However, there's also existing research that we know that mental health conditions, as you all know, also relate to suicide, increased risk, particularly depression, PTSD, and some other diagnoses. We also know that many service members aren't seeking services when they have these types of problems. They have the diagnosis, but they're not going. And one reason, there's evidence to suggest that one reason why they're not doing this is because there's a feeling of mental health stigma. So that's what I'm going to move into, and then I'll finish with question and answer. So this is just a quick overview of where we're located for those of you who are not familiar with Joint Base Lewis McChord. We're located approximately 45 minutes south of Seattle, south of here, and just south of Tacoma. Now I want to focus on what we do at T2. This, in a nutshell, we use technology to make people healthy. Our stakeholders are active duty service members, veterans, and their families. And as you can see here, our mission is to be leaders in innovation, to support the psychological health of these stakeholders And we have 3 areas that we focus on principally, and that's mobile health, telehealth, and emerging technology. We've assembled a team of experts that carries out this mission, and that carries us toward our vision, which is to leverage technology and behavioral science to create tools that will really help our stakeholders. Let me highlight a few areas next where we're focused. Start with mobile health. We have an array of mobile health apps that we've developed in-house and tested, and these are all available for download, and you're welcome to visit our website where we have more information about all of these apps. One I could just point out very quickly, for example, we have the Breathe to Relax, and that teaches diaphragmatic breathing techniques, and it's a very popular one, progressive relaxation type of an application. Next, I'll direct your attention to 2 websites that we've got. One of them is named afterdeployment.org, and as that name implies, it's oriented toward service members and veterans who are returning, and there are a number of workshops on there, everything from PTSD to depression to sleep disturbances. It's really got a lot of good information, and it's oriented towards subclinical type problems, and it's got workbooks in each of these subject areas. And then, of course, we can't forget the kids, so we have a website that's named Military Kids Connect, and that's where military children are able to have dialogues with other kids and look at videos, and really it's intended to support the kids who are in these military families. Last, we're very interested in telehealth, and we're experimenting with many different solutions to bring mental health services to those individuals, service members, veterans who do not have easy access to mental health services. So my efforts are research, and this is the division that I'm with, the Research Outcomes and Investigations division, and you can see that we focus on testing solutions. That's a big part of it. We want to look at all of our products and make sure that they're good, that they are tools that are needed, and that they work the way that they're intended to work. And so yeah, I'll focus more on some of these elements as we go on, but right now, let's look up the corner here. The DODSR is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Department of Defense Suicide Event Report. And so with that introduction, let's go ahead and focus on that. Dig into it a little bit deeper. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that this system, it was stood up in 2008, and many people worked on this project, and so I would like to acknowledge these people. Some of these people have moved on. However, some of them are still working on this team. Dr. Gregory Gom is the director of T2, and Dr. Mark Rieger is a deputy director. Okay, so what is the purpose of the DODSR? It's, as I outlined at the beginning, it is a surveillance process and system, and what it's designed to do is to capture detailed information about suicide events worldwide. This is fatal and non-fatal suicide events. And pictured over here on the right, you can see that's the portal. So it's a secure website through which all the data are accumulated and aggregated for analysis. And there's a designated point of contact who enters all of these data. And we'll get into more of those details in the next slide. The DODSR has been around for 5 years. This is a piece of history. Before the inception of the DODSR, then each of the services collected their suicide data through different processes. So as you can imagine, it was difficult to make comparisons within and across the services. So the goal here was to have a system with standardized data collection. And so T2 worked very closely with the services, and also this organization, the SPARC, which is the Suicide Prevention and Risk Reduction Committee, and worked to develop this system that was launched January 1, 2008. And on the other page, as I showed you, there is a portal through which these data are entered, and you can see, as listed on the slide here, we collect all regular active guard and reserve, activated guard and reserve, and the way that the command in each military installation is notified of a suicide, of an actual death that occurs, a suicide completion. The Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, or AFMES, contacts the command once a death is confirmed as a suicide, and that initiates our process whereby DODSers are submitted by behavioral health providers largely, also some command-appointed representatives and other personnel, but it's one person who enters each discrete DODSer. So let's look at the DODSer method. Here's a diagram that will give you maybe a better feel for how this works. So, as I said, we collect data on suicide completions as well as non-fatal events. So the triggering mechanism for the suicide event is the AFMES. When the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System indicates that this is indeed a suicide, then they can notify the command, and then the point of contact submits the DODSer. On the other hand, when it's a non-fatal event, then the trigger mechanism for that is when a service member is either evacuated from theater or hospitalized for some sort of suicidal behavior. And then we can just kind of follow the flow down. For suicides, there's those must be submitted within, those reports are submitted within 60 days, 30 days for attempts. And the end product, at the end of each year, we release a report, an annual report. And these data are all put together. We have all these reports available on our website, so feel free to look at those if you have interest in these. And the reason why we do this, obviously, we're very interested in understanding this whole phenomenon, and prevention is really the goal here. And so we present these data annually to senior leaders. And as I said, we also disseminate it through our website. So I've pulled some high-level data just to give you a taste of what the types of data that we collect. You can see here the rates over the last 3 years, not the last 3 years, but the last 3 years that we've published. And you can see it's pretty flat across those 3 years. And then in the other, we've broken down by service. And this gives you an idea of the importance of why we initiated this system, because the standardization allows us to look at the data across the services in multiple ways. We can collapse, and as you can see here, the Army seems to be driving some of these higher rates. So, yes?
Is this only active duty members, or is this active duty and veterans?
It's not veterans. So it's active duty and also active active guard and reserve and activated guard and reserve. So these are the demographics. These are the ones that are at risk, as you can see here. Young male under 25. And then I point out at the bottom here that attempts and suicide completions are distinct but overlapping. There are a few differences. Seem to be more females and more educated, more junior enlisted. So anyway, now that you know more about the DODSer, I'd like to share with you the project that I mentioned about linking, using this unique methodology to link our surveillance system with the CDC's National Violent Death Reporting System. And before we begin, these are our collaborators, so I would like to acknowledge them. Give you a little bit of background. This really, I think, pulls into perspective how significant the rate change for suicides among the active duty is. It's doubled from 04 through 2008, and it's continued to rise over the years. And I point this out because obviously, traditionally, soldiers and all service members have been sort of believed to benefit from what's known as a healthy soldier effect, and so they've had typically much lower suicide rates than civilians. So that's a big part of what's driving our efforts to understand and prevent suicides, is understand why is there this spike now. So why do we link these two systems, surveillance systems? The reason why we want to do this is because we wanted to look at, first of all, we wanted to look at how these known risk factors fall out, really just looking sort of at the frequency of these, and see if we can maybe better understand what's going on if we combine data from two different repositories or surveillance systems. So to put this another way, we combine elements from each. The DODSR contains very comprehensive information on the military population. There's over 200 items, whereas the NBDRS collects all of these data sources, or data from these sources you see listed on the slide. So narrative data from all of these, the law enforcement, etc. And the idea moving forward, and what drove this project, was that we hopefully would be able to better characterize and understand what's going on. The National Violent Death Reporting System aggregates data, just to give you a little bit of background, across 18 states. And you can see here that they do this because they want to inform decision makers and program planners. And also this is used as a way to evaluate state-based prevention programs. So that's why they stood that up. And there is a move to expand the NBDRS to encompass all 50 states. So they're moving that direction, but not quite there yet. The data sources, more explicitly, this is a little bit, repeats what you saw before, but gets into a little more detail about the death certificate information. So that information is a little bit different from what we collect because it has more proximal information. When our data are collected for the DODSR, then the point of contact digs through all kinds of records to try to figure out what was going on. In some services, they conduct interviews, but sometimes it's limited and we don't know exactly what was happening, although we can, in many cases we do, sometimes we don't. The NBDRS, that's part of what they do. They investigate what was going on right before. So we commissioned a pilot study that I'm going to show you right here. And this was just a feasibility test. We wanted to test this new methodology. Can we successfully link these two large surveillance systems? And so what we started small in scale with de-identified data. The reason for that is because the NBDRS collects data from all the states and other 17 or 18 states. However, if we used personally identifiable information, then we would have had to go back to each of those states, and it would have been very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do this research. So we used unidentified information, and it says ACER there. As I said, the DODSR was stood up in 2008. Prior to that, each service did their own methodology for collecting these data. In the Army, they use the Army Suicide Event Report, or ACER, and actually that's the model from which the DODSR was designed. This gives you a little bit more information about how we did our matching. The matching, our partners at the CDC actually conducted the matching, and they matched on these variables. During the period of from 05 to 07, there were 285 Army suicides. And of those, 59 were eligible because they turned up in CDC states. Then the next step, we matched those, and with a high degree of confidence, 95%. So let's look at the results. I'm going to go through some of these. This is, again, it's all descriptive data, but this was the first pilot in a number of studies that moving forward will become more complex. You can see here the demographics. These demographics, which you all know, are very similar to the suicide demographics and the civilian sector. Typically younger, male, white, and in the services lower are junior enlisted service members. So one question you might have, I just thought I'd clarify. These rates here, they're very similar to the overall demographic in the Army, right? In the Army, it's principally male, younger, and so forth. So this is very similar. And as I also said, it's very similar to the suicide demographics in the civilian. And so one might wonder, is it just that the demographic of the armed services is driving the suicide? But that is not the case for a couple of reasons. First is that, as I said back several years ago, before this spike, the demographics haven't changed, and it was only 10 per 100,000. Also, when we calculate rates in the military, we adjust for gender and all these other things. So it's not the military culture per se that's driving it, or at least the demographic. It seems to be a similarity with civilian suicides. These are just to let you take a look here. About half were married, or more than half actually, and largely active duty. Table 2 shows background characteristics. This shows where, as you might expect, most of these events occurred in the home. Firearms, most common methods, followed by hanging. And then down at the bottom, we collect information through the DODSR to find out if it was premeditated and so forth, through asking if there was any kind of evidence or a suicide note. And as you can see, over a third of these cases, there was some evidence. So that's helpful information. In this table, I'm showing some of the health-related circumstances, and these data, I put this slide in here just to kind of show you what we get from some of the things that we get from the MBDRS. And their narratives, they ask these questions about was there a current depressed mood, and through all these different agencies that do the investigation, and also was there some sort of ideation and these sorts of things. So it's more proximal. And sometimes more efficient. If sometimes when we're doing a DODSR, we may just have records and not necessarily know these things. So that's, again, value added to combining these two data sources. And alcohol use, as you would expect, as you all know, is a risk factor. And so about a third were using, or almost a third, used drugs or alcohol during the event. Table 4 shows the mental health characteristics. Probably no surprises here. Just would like to clarify that 13 were diagnosed with a current health care problem, and then mental health problem, and then below are the percentages among those individuals. So no surprise that at the top of the list is depression. And the next table, Table 5, shows stressors that were known prior to the suicide event. Up at the top, intimate partner problems, and that's shown up in other studies as well, civilian as well as military. And so that was interesting, not surprising, but interesting and consistent. And the military, one thing that we're trying to really get at is, are there differences in the military population, and really try to understand this puzzle. And so what were some of these military specific circumstances, and of those who did indicate there was some sort of circumstance of that nature, 60% indicated it was a job problem. And then down at the bottom, you can see that about a third had a recent crisis within the last 2 weeks. So the pilot study found, this is my summary and conclusions. Demographic characteristics, they reflected the general Army population and also the larger military population. And also similar to civilian suicide characteristics. Intimate problems, intimate partner problems, and military-related stress are something we probably need to investigate. And so focusing, obviously focusing, oh, sorry, there's a question?
You showed that marriage doesn't seem to be a protective factor. A much higher incidence of individuals who commit suicide or commit suicide that are married. Isn't that what you showed?
So the question is whether married individuals are at higher risk potentially for suicide.
I think that's what your data showed.
Well, what the data, so there's limitations to this data because we don't have a control. In this particular study, we have done a study. Actually, my team did a study where we actually looked at suicide mortality as an outcome, and a very large sample with enterprise level data. And the finding was we had about 1,700 cases of suicide mortality, and we also looked at, we matched those. It was a matched case control to about 5,000 service members matched on relevant demographics. And what we found in that study was that intimate partner problems, according to 2 indices, were related to suicide mortality. So, and that was a very well-designed big study. In this study, because it's smaller scale, we can't really draw that conclusion, but we can certainly, it's consistent with what we found elsewhere. Again, I want to emphasize that the methodology that is kind of new and unique in the study, and so that's sort of the piece that we were focusing on. But that a very good question. But there is research in the military sector that does show that problems in the relationship. We don't know so much about protective factors. I think that's what you're getting to. Hopefully that answers. Okay. All right. So let's move on. So there's some similarities between the military decedents. However, I hope can you guys hear me okay? Okay, just want to make sure I'm projecting. So there was some indication, at least with the job stressors, even though we saw overall, okay, the risk factors seem to be the same for the civilian and the military population, but then there was some evidence that maybe some job stress, and obviously there could be many things that we don't know about. So this is another study. It's under review right now, so I'm not at liberty to discuss the results. But basically what we did is we matched we added more data years. So we took the DODSER data for Army suicide decedents from 2005 to 2010 and combined those across the MVDRS and the DODSER. And then we drew from the MVDRS case controls matched on the appropriate variables and compared to see are there certain risk factors that are really unique, because obviously then we can tailor our suicide efforts more toward the military if there's something in the military. So anyway, more to follow on that one. So now I'm going to do a transition into the second, or actually the remaining third of my presentations. I indicated at the beginning that stigma is relevant. It's very relevant because service members seem to, based on studies that are out there, survey data, that they're not really accessing services. So I'm going to show you a video now that'll really say it much more clearly from the service members themselves than I could. Here we go.
I guess the biggest issue in the Army right now is stigma. Soldiers do not want to access behavioral health. to lead over their career?
You know, because we've got this stigma that is that mental health stigma. People get mental health, they run the other way.
There's got to be tens of thousands of people that are just doing it the Army way, sucking it up and driving on.
We have in our society kind of a reluctance to seek help for emotional or mental reasons, mental conditions.
They are more likely not to ask for help. They are more likely not to stand up and say, I'm hurt, someone please help me. That's part of the Army culture.
I think there's a lot of soldiers, officers, and COs in the military who think that way too, that they think they'll be ostracized if they go and seek any kind of help.
That's ingrained in you from the first day in the Army. To say I'm hurt or I need to see someone shows that you're weak or that you're admitting weakness, and nobody wants to do that.
There are biases that we hold culturally, militarily against individuals who have psychological problems.
It's really up to leaders to take a stand and try and change that culture, to try and let people know it's okay to say, please help me.
Okay. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what some of these service members are going through. And I want to highlight here, this is a recent publication by Charles Hogue and Carl Castro, and these are two leaders in military health, behavioral health. And they published this paper and they highlighted the challenges at Stigma. They've really done the work, and stigma really does seem to be a problem. Hogue earlier conducted a study and found that of those individuals who have diagnoses, only about maybe 23 to 40% are seeking care. So we're missing an opportunity here just because, you know, we could potentially, if we can reach these people and get them in, then we could potentially reduce suicide. So what we wanted to do, this is a project that I led, to develop and test a measure that looked at the whole range of stigma associated with the military. And one thing I'd like to say here and pause for a moment is when we think about the military and when we think about the civilian sector as far as mental health, they're very, very different. In the military, there's not confidentiality. Your commander must know when you go seek services, so there's that issue. There's also the military culture, which really emphasizes tough-mindedness and very, very good values, but values that could interfere, self-reliance, things of that nature that may interfere because that is the way that they're trained and oriented. And you could see where that could potentially interfere with service members going and seeking. They may try to help themselves rather than or going out and reaching out to all the services that exist. So let's look at some of the theoretical components of stigma. This is a model that we used for this study, and it's drawn from Corrigan. These are the theoretical underpinnings that stigma, and this is drawn from the civilian world, but we adapted it to this model because I think it's a good one. Public stigma is really, in a nutshell, it's external perceptions of stereotypes, what the larger society says about people who seek mental health care. Whereas self-stigma is distinguished from public stigma because it's really more internalized feelings of incompetence, things that a person feels when they have to reach out and receive mental health care. So the thought is that these two dimensions influence whether or not somebody accesses service or not. Next, I'm going to show you a theoretical model that was designed by Vogel, Wade, and Heckler that put together a model based on these constructs. And so they extended it. Basically, this was a mediational model that panned out. It was tested, and it looked like things could work this way in the civilian world. So it's pretty easy to follow if you're internalizing what's society saying, or your culture, in the case of the military, and they're saying, you're weak if you get mental health services, then that could potentially lead to feelings of inferiority within oneself about going and seeking the help. And so obviously that would influence your attitude toward accessing these services. There's one thing I want to say about this model. This is a model, it's a good model, but there's other pieces of this I just want to highlight because it'll be pertinent later. So this model suggests that the public stigma really drives the self-stigma, and that's what influences these attitudes, and that's very well the case and can be the case. However, if you think about it, there are also people who, they buy into this and they have this self-stigma, but they could be suffering so much that they just go ahead, and as I imagine many of you are clinicians and have come across this, they still go ahead because they're suffering. And they get these services, but they're still carrying that self-stigma inside. So later on I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to, this is just one way that this works. Obviously it's much more complicated than what's depicted here. So let me speed this up. It looks like I'm running a little bit short on time here. So I'll briefly go, and this paper, I'm happy to, if anybody's interested in more information, I will be very, very happy to email it to you. Just give me your card or email me, and I'll send it your way. Okay, so for self-stigma, basically we had 10 items, and Vogel and Wade, they're experts in the civilian world, and so we collaborated with them. We used their existing model because there's no reason to believe that self-stigma would vary. The items are very generic, so we used that. It's been validated in a number of studies, so we went with that. What we did that was different is we developed public stigma items geared toward the military. So military culture, what in the military culture might be a reason that service members don't collect or connect to services or to mental health services. And we developed 18 items using these methods, and the final set was reviewed by subject matter experts. So we recruited over 1,000 soldiers, and these are the demographics. We recruited them from the post-deployment reassessment program, and so all service members have to go through this screening. It's a post-deployment screening, 6 months to a year following deployment, and so it was basically a group of healthy soldiers that took this, and the demographic reflects the general military. And so what we decided to do, we had roughly 1,000. So rather than just conduct an exploratory factor analysis, which wouldn't be a very strong model, it'd be more data-driven, we decided to split the sample randomly into two samples, the scale development sample and the confirmatory sample, as you can see. So the first thing we did was the exploratory factor analysis, and that led to the adoption of 2 factors, public and self. And again, there's a lot of detail here. It's all in my paper, so I'm very happy to share that to answer any questions that you might have about this methodology. Importantly, both factors were internally consistent, as you can see here. And so this was sort of a first step to support, that our items fit the culture. So then obviously we next conducted a confirmatory factor analysis, and the model fit, and we tested 2-factor versus 1-factor, which does then suggest we've got 2 dimensions going on here. Okay, now I'm just going to give you a very brief high-level analysis of the factors. Factor 1, as I said, we had 18 items. 2 of them didn't hold. These 2 that you see here, not sure why that happened. Factor 2, as would be expected because this is a well-tested measure, all of those items held, and as you also would expect, each dimension, the dimensions correlated highly, but not so highly that it would just be one thing. And so on this next slide, I'm just going to show you briefly, these are only the public stigma items to show you what we put together. So these are the things, these all had high factor loadings, which is outlined in my paper. You know, these are the things that are concerned, the chain of command discovering what's going on here. Is it going to hurt their promotion? Would their peers look down on them? Would their subordinates, what would they do? What would they think? So that's sort of the culture out there. And anyway, it looks like we tapped some useful items here. A few more analysis really briefly. We looked at differences in self-stigma, public stigma, really not very many differences in public stigma. In self-stigma, men had higher self-stigma, which you might expect, and the civilian literature indicates that females are more likely to seek mental health services. Caucasians had more than African Americans. All these findings are consistent with these studies listed below. At the bottom, this is an important finding, I think. The soldiers who, we asked them if they had sought mental health services in the past, and those who had were lower on public stigma, on self-stigma than public, but not public stigma. So that would imply that they're aware of what's out there, but they've gone ahead and accessed services, and perhaps it was a good experience. Maybe they felt better and they realized, you know what, this is a good thing to do. So let's talk just a little bit about the implications of these findings. One is, I'm going to start with self-stigma. So from that, just to carry over from that last point, and this is supported in the literature, if an individual does go on to seek services and it's helpful, then that may help reduce self-stigma within that individual. This is, these other points here, I want to return to that first model that I showed you, where the public stigma was driving the self-stigma, and that seemed to imply that prevents people from seeking service. It doesn't. There are many people, as you know, as clinicians, who seek it because they're extremely distressed. But there's some very interesting studies out here that looked at the effect of self-stigma among people seeking treatment. And what they found is that, like, for example, alcohol dependence, that's one that carries a very highly stigmatizing label, that particular diagnosis. And one of the studies looked at that and found that even when symptoms were met with that diagnosis and other diagnoses, if they're still high on self-stigma, you know, they're going through this but they feel secretive, like it's something they have to hide, then it's sort of like they expect to be rejected on some level, perhaps, and adopt a secretive, interactive style. It's not a good outcome, because research has shown that if it is addressed in the therapy, it doesn't mean that everybody in therapy feels this, but some do, and if it's addressed well, then it leads to better outcomes, and outcomes have been shown to actually be nullified when self-stigma. They actually tested it with some very good studies. So just wanted to add that. Public stigma strategies in place to reduce this also. So it's multifaceted. Many different layers that obviously the time doesn't allow me to get to here, and many things we don't know about it. But you know, at the public, which you saw here, the video where you had high ranking and all different service members of different ranks talking about this, that potentially can encourage people to go seek services and reduce any kind of stigma, self-stigma that they may have related to that. And so the public policy that drives a lot of decisions and what's allocated to resources. So we believe that designing this measure is sort of a first step to really kind of understanding the scope of this problem and help us target intervention areas and also evaluate programs that are designed to reduce stigma. So, and this is just sort of rehashing everything I've already said. Let's just let you take a look at this. We definitely need to do more work in the future on this. This was just an initial study, and in fact this is a study that's designed to further examine the military stigma measure that we developed. This is currently deployed on our afterdeployment.org website, T2's designated website. And so service members can access, it's a link, and they can fill out the survey. And the reason that we put this out there was because we would like to establish, now that we know there seem to be two dimensions, does that hold with a broader range of service members, and also look at some construct validity. So that's ongoing and in the works. Okay, so just like to wrap up here, suicide is a challenge and it's a key priority. And at T2 we have a number of projects that are oriented toward learning more about suicide and trying to help inform suicide prevention initiatives, including our collaboration with the CDC. And we think that understanding mental health stigma may perhaps increase access to care, which may in turn reduce suicide. And that's all I have. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask a question about the advancement. So you mentioned a lot about stigma, but there was a perception, it sounded like in the video, that people would not be advanced in their career if they actually presented. And, you know, just as a layperson, I would probably think the same thing. And so I wonder what the military's process is for people who actually present with mental health problems, and do those people actually end up not advancing, and is there any data on that?
That is a wonderful question. So the question is, goes back to one of the items on the stigma scale about concerns about being advanced in the military if one were to access mental health care. And the answer is we don't really know. There hasn't been a study. There should be a study on that. One option that is available to service members, I'm not sure if it's, I'm pretty sure it's enlisted too, but definitely officers, there is an option to seek mental health. Well, there's always the option to seek it outside the system. And I know just anecdotally from some other research that we're doing that some service members have expressed a reticence to seek mental health care, and they go ahead and they do it on their own dollar. They go and because they don't want to harm their career. On the other hand, I just think it's hard to know because it really depends on the command, it depends on the unit. It's a big question, but a very relevant one. So thank you. Yes?
I think when you talk about stigma in the military, you need to also be selective about which branch you're talking about. There's a great deal of difference.
Mm-hmm.
The Air Force pretty much has a zero tolerance
Mm-hmm.
there for certain reasons, justifiably and maybe some not so. But anyway, by experience, I've seen a great deal of difference. I worked in both dimensions, with both segments of the population.
That is an excellent observation. So the gentleman indicated that one thing that's really important to look at is what are the differences among the services, and that even goes back to the dots here, why we look at the services, because they're very different. They all have cultures. And this gentleman was talking specifically about the Air Force where there's zero tolerance. And so if you're a pilot and you're on some sort of a psychotropic medication, that's it. And so it's kind of a tough thing. And so I think that's very important to be mindful of that. It could be that lower enlisted or junior enlisted individuals, maybe they're more likely or less likely. It could be also within the unit. There's been a fair amount of work done on unit cohesion, and what we found anecdotally and also in other research is that when there's tight unit cohesion and really sort of a supportive sense among the unit, then service members, they really want to support each other, and it's okay if you get behavioral health services. On the other hand, we know of extreme cases where there are units where if they find out you've gone, you're completely ostracized, which is a terrible thing because that you live and breathe the military when you're active duty. So it's a terrible thing if that happens. Yes.
Going back to your original work on actual mortality rates of suicide, I'm curious of whether or not any of your analyses actually look at the number of deployments, because we know that the change in actual 1% of the U.S. population is currently serving or have active duty members, and we know that the number of deployments have exponentially increased compared to any other wars we've ever been in. And so I'm always surprised when we're surprised by the rates of suicide when I realize that we are asking people to go back 4, 5, 6, up to 12, 15 deployments. And so
that's an excellent question. So the gentleman asked if there's a link between deployment and suicide, because this escalation in rates certainly coincides with the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we do know that many of these service members have been on extended deployments, multiple deployments. So could this be driving the suicide rate? That's really the $64,000 question. I'm very happy to say that a grant that I'm working on, our at T2, the deputy director, Dr. Mark Rieger, is PI on a large grant that I'm a co-investigator on, and that's the grant that was spoken of very early on. And so the idea there is we have a huge data set that we put together that encompasses 01 all the way through 2007. Every single service member who was ever on active duty at the beginning of our window, plus all accessions. So it's huge. And that's the type of methodology that's been lacking. We haven't really been able to do that because people do a study here, they do a study there, but they don't have the denominator. We've got the denominator. So we have looked at this question, and it's getting very close to publication. I don't know if I want to give away the story, but it's a good one. I'll just say provisionally, that doesn't seem to be what's driving it, but more to follow on that. That study is in the offing, and it will be out there, and it will provide a lot of really interesting findings. We're very close to releasing that.
It may not be driving suicide. It's driving a lot of other behavioral issues with this population.
Pardon me?
It may not be driving suicide, but it's driving a lot of other behavioral issues that are deteriorating.
That's another great comment that maybe not deployment per se, but that's driving other factors. And a very interesting, prominent researcher, Kang and Bowman research team that you guys, you're nodding your heads, you're aware of the wonderful work that they have done on this topic. And what they have found is that it's not really deployment per se, it's deployment in combination with being wounded, or maybe a psychiatric condition. That makes sense, right? You're under stress, and maybe you have an amputation. Maybe you're absolutely disabled, or you've got some going into it. Maybe you had a mental health problem, or one arises. Those are the interesting questions that we're going to investigate in the future. Other questions?
Thank you. Come back.
Okay. Thanks very much.